at 28. Clara Bennett had almost nothing left. Her mother was dead after a long illness that had consumed nearly every dollar Clara had saved. Her apartment was gone, and everything she still owned fit inside a borrowed camper parked behind a roadside diner in the Colorado mountains.
Then she noticed a county notice offering an abandoned mountain station called Black Pine for just $1. The building had been empty for 23 years. Its roof leaked, the road was failing, the plumbing barely existed, and whoever bought it would inherit every repair and responsibility that came with it. Nobody else wanted the place. Clara bought it anyway. When people at the diner heard what she had done, some laughed and told her she had managed to turn $1 into thousands of dollars of problems. Even Daniel Reed, a local carpenter, warned her that a $1 building could become the most expensive thing she had ever owned. But Clara wasn't looking for wealth. After months without a home of her own, she simply wanted 4 walls nobody could tell her to leave. Then, while clearing decades of broken furniture and animal nests from the station, Clara noticed something strange. The measurements inside the building didn't match its exterior walls. Several feet of space seemed to be missing. An old floor plan confirmed what shouldn't have been possible. There was another room behind the storage wall, but no visible entrance. After moving heavy shelving, Clara found an old reinforced door hidden behind it, secured by a lock that had apparently remained untouched since Black Pine Station closed in 1973. When she finally opened that door, she didn't find gold, cash, or jewels. She found filing cabinets, rolled survey maps, original deeds, forgotten leases, and boxes of records bearing names that still appeared on properties throughout Silver Pass. Then Clara unrolled one particular map and froze. Black Pine Station sat at its center, but the boundary lines stretched far beyond the ruined building she thought she had purchased, across thousands of acres of mountain land. And when a retired county clerk examined the first documents, she noticed one word that changed the meaning of everything. Some of the land everyone believed had been sold decades earlier had actually been leased. Buried among those records was an agreement connected to property rights potentially worth millions of dollars. And Clara's $1 deed contained a line nobody seemed to have noticed. But before we discover what that line meant, and whether a woman who had barely enough money to repair a leaking roof had unknowingly purchased rights to something worth millions, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now, whether you're starting your morning, taking a break in the afternoon, or listening late at night. I hope you have a wonderful day or a peaceful evening. And if you enjoy emotional stories about abandoned places, hidden histories, unexpected discoveries, and ordinary people whose lives change with a single decision, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next story. Now, let's return to the Colorado mountains, where Clara Bennett was about to spend the only dollar anyone offered for a place the entire town believed was worthless at 28. Clara Bennett measured her life by what fit inside a borrowed camper: 2 boxes of clothes, her mother's photographs, a toolbox that had belonged to her father, 3 cooking pans, 4 books, and an envelope containing what remained of her savings. The camper sat behind the roadside diner outside Silver Pass, Colorado, where Clara worked whatever shifts the owner could give her. Her mother had died the previous winter after a long illness. Medical expenses and months of reduced work had consumed nearly everything Clara had saved. Soon afterward, she lost her apartment. The camper belonged to a diner co-worker's brother, who had said she could use it until spring. Spring had already passed. One afternoon in 1996, Clara noticed a county disposal notice pinned beside the diner register. Black Pine Station minimum bid $1. She read it twice. The abandoned mountain way station had been empty since 1973. The county wanted responsibility for the deteriorating structure transferred to a private owner. The buyer would accept the property as is, including maintenance obligations and access problems. There's a reason it costs $1, a customer told her. Because nobody wants it. Daniel Reed heard about Clara's interest before her shift ended. He was a local carpenter and volunteer with Mountain Rescue, and his grandfather had once done maintenance at Black Pine. "Don't buy that building," he said when he found her outside the diner. "Have you seen it?" "Not recently." "I have. Roofs failing in places, road washes out, no dependable heat, plumbing may not work at all. But the structure is still standing." Daniel stared at her. That is a dangerously low standard for buying property. Clara drove up the following morning. The road narrowed as it climbed through pine forest, its ruts deep enough that she had to slow almost to walking speed. Black Pine Station stood alone against the mountainside, a long, weathered building with peeling paint and dark windows. One section of roof sagged. Weeds pushed through the steps. Inside, dust covered everything. Animal nests filled one corner. Water stains spread across the ceiling, and cold air slipped through gaps around the windows. Clara walked from room to room anyway. She found 2 spaces on the southern side where the roof appeared sounder. One had a small stove. The other had enough room for a bed and table. She pressed her palm against a wall and imagined it clean, patched, painted. It was a ruin. It was also the first place in months where she could picture unpacking her boxes. Back in Silver Pass. Clara submitted the minimum bid. There were no competing offers. The county accepted her $1. At the diner, news traveled before she finished her coffee. "You actually bought Black Pine?" someone asked. "For $1?" Laughter came from 2 stools down. "Should have kept the $1. Another customer asked how much a new roof would cost. Clara did not know. That produced more laughter. Daniel was less amused. "Buying it is the cheap part." "I know." "Do you?" "I can patch a roof. I can clean. Dad taught me enough carpentry to make 2 rooms livable." "And everything you can't fix, I learn, trade work, or wait." Daniel shook his head. "You're stubborn. Currently, it's one of my more valuable possessions." 3 days later, Clara drove to Black Pine with her belongings packed behind her. She carried the photographs inside first, then the toolbox. By evening, one corner was swept. The stove had been inspected but not trusted, and a mattress lay beneath the driest section of ceiling. Clara stood outside as the sun dropped behind the mountains. She owned the building beneath her hand, not rented, not borrowed. Hers. Then thunder rolled across the pass. Rain began before she could finish unloading. Clara rushed inside and placed a bucket beneath the first leak. Then another appeared. Water began dripping near the hallway, followed by a third leak above one of the rooms she had hoped to repair. She moved her mother's photographs away from the wall and listened as rain struck the failing roof for the first time in months. Clara Bennett owned a roof. It was already raining through it. By morning, Clara had counted 7 leaks. 2 were minor drips, 3 required buckets, 1 had soaked a section of ceiling plaster, and the worst had found the only place she had left a cardboard box on the floor. Fortunately, it contained clothes rather than her mother's photographs. Clara carried everything dry into the southern room and began making lists. Roof patches, window seals, chimney inspection, plumbing, floor repair. The list reached the bottom of the page before she had inspected half the station. She spent her mornings working at Black Pine and drove down for diner shifts in the afternoons. She cleared broken furniture, swept out animal nests, removed ruined curtains, and covered sections of damaged roof with materials she could afford. The old plumbing produced brown water briefly, then nothing. A pipe beneath a sink had split years earlier. The stove needed attention before she dared light it. Her remaining savings shrank with every box of nails, sheet of plywood, and gallon of fuel. Daniel arrived on her 4th morning carrying a ladder
and wearing the expression of a man prepared to say he had warned her.
"I didn't ask you to come."
"I know. That's why I came before you climbed onto that roof alone." He inspected the rafters, chimney, and damaged floor. His conclusions were better than Clara feared and worse than she hoped. The main structure remained sound enough to repair, but several roof sections needed serious work. The plumbing would require replacement in places. One rear room had water damage that made it unusable. "Buying something for $1 doesn't mean it costs $1, Daniel said. Clara pulled a loose nail from a window frame. "You've mentioned that. I'm hoping repetition helps. It doesn't." Daniel looked at the tools beside her. "Your father teach you basic carpentry? Enough to know which jobs I shouldn't pretend I can do." "That puts you ahead of half the people who hire me." Clara offered to pay him for the inspection. Daniel refused cash, but accepted her proposal that she help with bookkeeping for his small carpentry business in exchange for occasional advice. She would not owe him charity. Over the next week, one southern room became almost livable. Clara sealed a window, repaired loose boards, and created a dry corner for her mattress and belongings. The progress was modest, but each repaired piece made the station feel less like something abandoned and more like something waiting. The discovery came while she was clearing the old storage area. Heavy wooden shelving covered one wall, loaded with rusted cans, broken brackets, and decades of debris. Clara emptied it section by section. As she worked, she noticed the room felt unusually narrow. She stepped outside and walked along the same side of the building, counting paces from the rear corner to the nearest window. Then she repeated the measurement inside. The numbers did not match. Daniel returned 2 days later and found her measuring the storage room with a tape. "Problem? Maybe I've forgotten how walls work." She showed him the measurements. Several feet of interior space were unaccounted for. Daniel checked twice. Could be a service cavity. That wide, unusual. They examined the wall. Nothing suggested a recent alteration. The boards were old, dusty, and apparently undisturbed. Clara searched nearby cabinets and found nothing useful. Later, while sorting a stack of damaged papers left in an office drawer, she discovered a folded sheet, printed with the station's basic floor plan. Most labels were faded but readable. Waiting area, office, storage, maintenance. Clara traced the rooms with one finger. Then she stopped. Behind the storage area was a small rectangular space clearly marked on the plan. Daniel. He came over. Clara handed him the paper. "That room." Daniel compared the plan with the wall. "Records office," he read. Clara looked around. "Where's the door?" They searched the storage area again, moving loose boards and checking every visible section. No doorway appeared. The old shelving occupied most of the wall where the floor plan indicated an entrance should have been. Daniel ran his hand along its heavy frame. "This shelving may not have always been here." Clara stared at the wall behind it. The station had been abandoned for 23 years, yet its original plan showed a room neither of them could enter. Someone had placed heavy storage shelving across the only obvious access point, leaving no visible door at all. Black Pine Station contained a room that had been sealed away from ordinary access, and Clara had just discovered exactly where it was. Moving the shelving took most of the morning. Clara and Daniel unloaded the last rustic containers, then discovered the unit had been screwed into both floor and wall. "Someone wanted this to stay put," Clara said. "Or they were worried it would fall on somebody," Daniel replied. "Less exciting, but more likely." They removed the fasteners and dragged the shelving forward inch by inch. Behind it, dust outlined a narrow, reinforced door almost the same color as the surrounding boards. A heavy lock hung from an old metal hasp. Clara crouched beside it. 23 years, maybe longer. Daniel pressed carefully against the doorframe. Before you open it, remember this building has spent decades leaking, shifting, freezing, and thawing. We don't know what condition that room is in. Clara glanced at the floor plan. It's inside the main structure, which improves the odds. It doesn't guarantee anything. She agreed to wait long enough to inspect the surrounding framing. Daniel found no obvious structural failure, but he still advised caution. Clara spent the afternoon searching for a key. Black Pine had provided her with an absurd collection of them. She found 6 hanging from labeled hooks in the former maintenance room boiler tool chest. Rear pump, office, and storage. None opened the records room lock. Another ring lay inside an old desk drawer. Those keys fit nothing she had found. Beneath them were receipts dated through 1973, maintenance notes, and invoices for paper, filing supplies, and heating oil. One receipt from only weeks before Black Pine closed included carbon paper and archival folders. Clara read it twice. They were still keeping records here right before the station shut down. Daniel looked over her shoulder. Apparently. Then somebody had access to that room. Doesn't mean the key survived. Clara searched for another day anyway. She checked drawers, cupboards, hooks, old coat pockets, and even the space beneath loose floorboards near the former office. Nothing. Finally, she returned to the locked door with her father's toolbox. I can cut it, Daniel offered. I'd rather not destroy anything if I don't have to. The hasp was badly corroded where it met the wood. Working slowly, they removed the deteriorated mounting hardware around the lock instead of breaking the door itself. When the last fastener came loose, the hasp dropped into Clara's hand with the lock still attached. She looked at Daniel. Ready. Open it slowly. The door resisted at first. Clara pulled harder, and the old seal broke with a dry crack. Stale air escaped from darkness. Daniel shone a flashlight inside before either entered. The room was small, windowless, and surprisingly dry. Metal filing cabinets lined 2 walls. Cardboard archival boxes occupied shelves at the back. Rolled maps stood upright in a wooden rack. There was no gold, no safe, no forgotten stack of cash. Clara laughed once, partly from relief and partly from embarrassment. Paper, a remarkable amount of it, Daniel said. She stepped inside carefully. Dust covered the floor but showed no obvious water damage. Whoever had built the room had protected it better than most of the station. Clara opened the nearest filing cabinet. Folders were arranged alphabetically. Their labels faded but readable. Access, grazing, leases, water. Another drawer contained correspondence and property records. Don't start pulling everything out, Daniel warned. I know. Clara had spent enough time doing bookkeeping to understand what happened when records lost their order. She carried a chair to the doorway and began examining only the first few folders, noting where each came from. Most meant little to her. Old names, parcel descriptions, payment receipts, agreements signed decades before she was born. Then she opened a long drawer containing survey documents. Several rolled maps were tied with brittle cotton tape. Clara selected one whose label read, Black Pine General Holdings Survey. She carried it into the storage room, where there was more space, and unrolled it carefully across the floor. Daniel held down one corner. Clara placed a flashlight on another. At first, she recognized only the station building and access road. Then she noticed the boundary lines. They did not stop around Black Pine's small parcel. Thick ink lines extended outward across mountain slopes, timber areas, grazing land, and waterways. Clara leaned closer. This can't all be the station. It isn't. Daniel traced one line without touching the paper. That goes well beyond this ridge. More parcel numbers filled the edges of the map. Some areas contained handwritten notations and dates. Clara retrieved the property description from her $1 county paperwork and compared it with the survey. Her deed described only a modest station parcel. The old map showed something vastly larger, with Black Pine marked near its center. "Maybe it's just a regional map," she said. Daniel pointed to the title again. General Holdings. Clara's excitement cooled into caution. An old map did not prove ownership. Boundaries could have changed dozens of times since it was drawn. Land could have been sold, transferred, divided, or condemned. Still, she returned to the records room and opened another drawer. Inside were deeds, lease agreements, and survey references using several of the same parcel numbers shown on the map. Clara carried one folder back into the light. Daniel was staring at the mountain boundaries. "How much land are we looking at?" she asked. He shook his head. "I wouldn't guess from this." Clara followed the ink lines across the paper until they disappeared beneath another rolled edge. She had bought an abandoned building because she needed somewhere to sleep. Now, behind a door hidden by old shelving, she had found records connecting Black Pine Station to what appeared to be thousands of acres of Colorado mountain land. Clara resisted the temptation to carry every document into town. The records had survived decades because the windowless room remained dry, and she refused to become the person who destroyed them through impatience. She bought pencils, index cards, and inexpensive folders, then began cataloging one cabinet at a time. Daniel helped build a clean work table from spare lumber. "For a woman with a leaking roof, you spend a lot of time organizing dead people's paperwork," he said. "The roof has been leaking for 23 years. These papers have been waiting longer." Most records were ordinary at first: maintenance expenses, grazing payments, access agreements, correspondence about fences and roads. Yet the same parcel numbers from the large survey appeared repeatedly. Clara needed someone who understood county records, so Daniel suggested Edith Monroe, a retired county clerk who had spent decades filing documents in Silver Pass. Edith arrived 2 days later, wearing sturdy shoes and carrying reading glasses in a hard case. She stopped at the records room doorway. "Well," she said quietly, "that explains some things." Clara turned. "What things?" "Maybe nothing yet." Edith refused to be rushed. She examined several deeds and compared signatures, seals, paper types, and filing marks. "These look consistent with county documents from the period," she said. "That does not mean everyone remained legally effective." "So they're real. They appear real. That's different from saying they prove what you hope they prove." Clara almost laughed. "I don't know what I hope they prove." Edith smiled. "Good. Keep it that way until the documents tell you." They spent the afternoon sorting copies of grazing agreements, water access contracts, and timber arrangements. Clara noticed many payments were annual or seasonal. One agreement gave a ranching family use of a mountain meadow for 10 years. Another granted a timber operator cutting rights within specified boundaries. "Leases," Clara said. "Mostly," Edith answered. "That was common. But some of these parcels are occupied now. A great deal can happen in 40 years. The following morning, Clara drove into Silver Pass with photocopies rather than originals. Edith obtained access to public property records, and they compared current parcel information with Black Pine's documents. Some old parcel numbers had changed. Others had been divided. Several showed later transfers that appeared perfectly ordinary. Clara began to think the map was merely a snapshot of ownership long gone. Then Edith stopped at one file. "That's odd." Clara leaned closer. "What?" Edith placed an old Black Pine agreement beside the county record. A tract north of the station was commonly treated as part of a larger private holding. The county file contained later references to its use, But the document Edith expected to see establishing an outright sale was absent. The Black Pine record described the tract as leased. Could the sale document be somewhere else? Clara asked. Certainly. Edith checked another parcel. The same problem appeared. Then a third. Clara felt her pulse quicken. So these people don't own the land? I did not say that. Edith's voice sharpened.
Never turn missing paperwork into a conclusion. Records get misplaced, instruments are filed under different names, parcels are renumbered, copies disappear while originals survive elsewhere. But this is unusual. Edith looked again at the files. Yes. They took the question to Miguel Alvarez, the county assessor. He listened patiently while Clara explained where the documents had been found. Miguel examined the copies but showed none of her excitement. An old deed can be authentic and still tell you nothing about present ownership, he said. Property gets conveyed, rights expire, courts issue judgments, governments change boundaries. Clara pointed to the missing transfers. And if there isn't a sale, first you prove there wasn't one. That takes more than failing to find it this morning. He advised preserving the originals exactly as found and creating a complete inventory. Clara left frustrated but grateful for the warning. Back at Black Pine, she and Edith returned to the cabinets. This time they searched for organizational patterns rather than valuable-looking papers. One phrase began appearing on letterheads and agreements from different years: Black Pine Community Land Trust. Clara found it on a water access document. Edith found it on grazing correspondence. Then Daniel uncovered a box whose label included the same name. Was Black Pine a trust? Clara asked. Edith removed her glasses. The station may have been its administrative office. What happened to it? I don't remember. One operating when I worked for the county. Clara searched another drawer and found references stretching across years, each connecting the trust to land shown on the survey. Yet none of the documents before them explained its end. If the trust had sold everything, there should have been transfers. If it had dissolved, there should have been some record of that too. Edith reminded her that absence still proved nothing. Clara knew she was right. But that evening, surrounded by files from the locked room, Clara wrote one question at the top of a fresh index card. When did Black Pine Community Land Trust end? She stared at the words. The old records suggested the trust had once controlled land across the mountain. The current records showed other people using much of it, but so far, nobody could explain when Black Pine had stopped owning it. Edith returned to Black Pine, carrying a notebook filled with dates from her years at the county clerk's office. I started after the station closed, she told Clara. But I remember the records transfer because people were still complaining about it years later. In 1973, Black Pine had shut down during a period of staff changes and shrinking county budgets. Boxes were supposed to be inventoried and moved into county storage. Some arrived labeled. Others came without useful descriptions. Water damaged part of one storage area several years later. Departments reorganized, employees retired. So somebody stole the missing records, Clara asked. Edith shook her head. People prefer that explanation because it makes neglect sound interesting. I never heard anything about theft. More likely everyone assumed someone else had handled them. That answer felt almost disappointingly ordinary. It also made sense. Clara looked toward the locked room. A reinforced door and shelving had preserved what bureaucracy had forgotten. They spent the morning matching Edith's notes to cabinet labels. Near the bottom of one filing cabinet, Clara found a thick folder marked Organization 1951. Inside lay correspondence from several mining families, property schedules, and a formal agreement establishing the Black Pine Community Land Trust. Clara carried it to the work table. Edith read slowly. The families had contributed mountain acreage and associated rights to a trust administered from Black Pine Station. Its stated purposes included preserving access, managing grazing and timber use, and maintaining land for the long-term benefit of the surrounding community. Here, Edith said, a section restricted outright sale of trust property except under specific conditions. Another described leases as a preferred means of producing income while retaining underlying land. Clara thought of the records they had already found. That explains all the leases. It explains why they existed. Does it explain who owns the land now? No. Edith tapped the agreement. This tells us what was intended in 1951. We still need to know what happened afterward. Clara felt both closer to an answer and farther from one. The document made Black Pine important. But importance was not ownership. That afternoon, a dark pickup climbed the station road. The driver was a broad-shouldered man in his early 60s with silver at his temples. Clara recognized the name when he introduced himself. Walter Crane owned Crane Timber and Development, which controlled significant acreage around Silver Pass. "Heard you've been digging through old records," Walter said. "Cataloging them. County records I found inside my building." His eyes moved toward the station. Black Pine collected plenty of paperwork over the years. His tone remained polite. Old leases, surveys, agreements. Most of it probably hasn't mattered in decades. Probably, Walter smiled slightly. Property history gets complicated. People find an old map and think they've discovered something nobody else knows. Clara wondered who had told him about the maps. In a town the size of Silver Pass? She decided the answer could be almost anyone. "I'm trying not to assume anything." Smart. Walter walked a few steps toward the building, studying the roof. "You planning to restore this place? Enough to live here." "That could become expensive." "I've noticed," he nodded as though confirming something. "I might save you the trouble." Clara waited. "I'll buy Black Pine from you. It wasn't advertised long ago. You could have bid. I didn't have a reason then." And now Walter looked toward the mountains before answering. "Now I know somebody actually intends to do something with it." He named a price. Clara stared at him. It was not a fortune, but it was thousands of times what she had paid, and enough to put her back into a rented apartment with money left over. Weeks earlier, she might have accepted before he finished speaking. "Why is a ruined station worth that much to you?" "Convenience. It sits near land my company works. I can use the site. With a bad roof and broken plumbing, I can afford repairs." Clara thought about the 1951 agreement lying on her work table. Walter had not threatened her or demanded the records. He had simply arrived after learning she was examining them and offered serious money for a building nobody had wanted for $1. "No," she said. His expression barely changed. "You should think about it." "I just did. The offer won't stay open forever. Then I suppose I'll have to survive the disappointment." Walter gave a short laugh. "Fair enough." He returned to his pickup without argument. Clara watched him drive down the mountain. Daniel arrived later with roofing material and found her still standing outside. She told him about the offer. "You refused?" "Yes." Because of the papers, Clara looked through the open doorway toward the hidden records room. Because yesterday this place was supposedly worth $1. She picked up the 1951 trust agreement again. Today, Walter Crane thinks it's worth thousands. Whatever the records represented, they were no longer merely pieces of forgotten Silver Pass history. Someone with land interests around Black Pine believed the ruined station mattered now. The morning after Walter Crane's visit, Clara drove to the county offices with the deed she had received for $1. Until then, she had treated it as proof of something simple. Black Pine Station belonged to her. Now every sentence seemed capable of meaning more than she understood. Miguel Alvarez read the document across his desk while Clara waited. "The legal description is the station parcel," he said. "That part is straightforward." "So the old trust land isn't mine?" "I didn't say that either." Miguel turned to the second page and pointed to a clause near the bottom. Most of it was standard language transferring improvements, access, and rights associated with the property. One phrase was different: surviving a pertinent administrative and beneficiary rights associated with Black Pine. Clara read it twice. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm not giving you an answer." "You're very good at that." "It keeps assessors from pretending to be lawyers." Miguel explained that appurtenant rights could attach to property, but whether these particular rights still existed depended on the trust. Later transfers, court actions, and decades of title history, the county had sold the station as recorded. That did not mean officials had knowingly transferred thousands of acres. Could that sentence mean nothing? Clara asked. Yes. Could it mean something? Also yes. Miguel recommended a title attorney. Clara's stomach tightened when she heard what even a preliminary review might cost. She was still buying roofing materials one paycheck at a time. Edith helped organize copies so an attorney would not waste paid hours sorting papers, and Clara used part of her remaining savings for the consultation. Several days later, she sat with Miguel and the attorney while documents from the locked room were compared against recorded transfers. The result was not the dramatic answer Clara wanted. It was a list. Some grazing rights had expired decades ago. Several parcels had been legitimately conveyed under provisions Clara had overlooked. A few old leases had been replaced by later agreements. Certain water and access rights were too uncertain to evaluate without additional research. But not everything disappeared. Several property interests connected to the trust had no clear termination. Some timber arrangements still traced back to leases rather than outright sales. Most importantly, the attorney could find no immediate evidence that the Black Pine Community Land Trust itself had been formally dissolved. "Does that mean I own it?" Clara asked. "It means we have more work before anyone should make that claim. And the wording in my deed, potentially important, not automatically decisive." Clara laughed without humor. "Every answer creates another bill." The attorney almost smiled. Property law had survived on that principle for generations. Back at Black Pine, Daniel found Clara replacing damaged boards near a window, harder than necessary. He took the hammer from her after she bent the second nail. Bad day. Complicated day. She explained what she had learned. So some of it's real. Some of it might still be real. Some definitely isn't. Nobody will tell me what the rest means without another week of research. Daniel leaned against the wall. What happens if they decide it's worth a fortune I repair the roof properly? Dream bigger. Clara looked around the room where her mattress still occupied one corner beside boxes of belongings. Fine. Plumbing that works every day. Daniel laughed. You're terrible at being unexpectedly rich. Her smile faded. I'd get a home nobody could take away. You already own this one. A county sold it for $1 because it was falling apart. Still yours. Clara looked through the window toward the mountain. I spent years wondering what bill would come next. Then Mom got worse, and every choice became what we could afford this week. After she died, I thought at least the bills would stop. Instead, I lost the apartment too. Daniel said nothing. If those papers were worth enough, she continued, I'd never have to wonder where I was going to live again. Saying it aloud made the desire sound less like ambition than fear. Daniel handed the hammer back. Then maybe figure out what you have before deciding what it has to fix. The next preliminary report arrived 2 days later. Clara read it at the work table inside Black Pine, while rain tapped against a section of roof she had finally managed to seal.
The attorney remained careful. Ownership was unresolved. Trust authority required legal confirmation. Several claimed rights were likely worthless. But surviving land use lease, access,
and beneficiary interests associated with Black Pine could have substantial present-day value if validated. Clara reached the final paragraph and stopped. Based on comparable land values and the commercial importance of the disputed rights, their potential combined value could reach several $1,000,000. She read the sentence again, then looked toward the locked records room. A month earlier, she had struggled to afford an apartment. Now, papers hidden behind an old door might represent millions. The report made equally clear that might was the most important word on the page. Walter Crane returned to Black Pine 3 days after Clara received the preliminary report. This time he did not come alone. A woman carrying a leather briefcase stepped from the passenger side of his pickup and introduced herself as an attorney representing Crane Timber and Development. Clara invited them inside but kept the records room door closed. Walter placed a folder on the work table Daniel had built. "I think we should stop guessing about each other's intentions," he said. His attorney explained the proposal. Crane would pay Clara a substantial settlement in exchange for transferring any disputed administrative beneficiary, lease, access, timber, or related rights that might have passed with Black Pine Station. Clara read the number and felt her throat tighten. It was more money than she had ever possessed, enough for a house with a roof that did not need buckets, enough to replace her aging vehicle, build savings, and stop measuring groceries against fuel. "You're offering this when my attorney hasn't even established that I control these rights?" she asked. Walter folded his hands. "Because uncertainty costs money too." His attorney added that Crane had invested for decades in roads, equipment, contracts, and timber operations based on property records everyone had accepted as valid. A title dispute could take years, and years cost me money I don't have. Clara said, "That is one practical reality," the attorney replied. The words were not a threat. That made them harder to dismiss. Walter leaned forward. "I'm not saying your documents are worthless. I'm saying there's a price for certainty. For both of us." Clara asked for time. They left the proposal with her. Daniel arrived that evening and found the folder open beside a calculator. Clara told him the amount. He whistled softly. "That would change things." "That's not advice." "You didn't ask for advice." "What would you do?" Daniel pulled out a chair but did not sit. "It isn't my property." "That's convenient. It's also true." Clara pushed the proposal toward him. "If I sign, this whole problem becomes Walter's. I fix Black Pine or buy somewhere else. I stop worrying about whether one broken pipe empties my bank account." "Sounds tempting. You're still not telling me what to do. Because if I tell you to take it and you regret it, I help choose your life. If I tell you to refuse and the rights turn out worthless..." "Same problem." Clara looked away, irritated because he was right. After Daniel left, she sat alone at the work table. Rain whispered against the repaired roof. The settlement figure remained in front of her. She imagined depositing the check. She imagined calling the diner and reducing her shifts. She imagined walking into a real estate office and choosing a home instead of taking whatever shelter someone offered. For the first time since her mother became ill, security seemed close enough to touch. Clara picked up a pen. Before signing, she opened the folder containing the 1951 trust agreement. She told herself she only wanted to confirm exactly what she was transferring. The document described the mining families who had contributed their land. It explained why the trust favored leases over sales. Income could support local needs, while the underlying mountain property remained protected. Then Clara reached the restrictions Edith had shown her. The language was old and formal, but its purpose was clear. The trust had been structured so temporary financial pressure could not easily force permanent disposal of community land. Clara lowered the pen. She thought of the families who had signed in 1951. They could not have known her. They could not have imagined a broke 28-year-old woman buying their abandoned administrative station for $1 in 1996. Yet the agreement anticipated the exact temptation sitting in front of her. One person with immediate financial needs offered money in exchange for something intended to outlast that person's hardship. The next morning, Daniel found her outside replacing a loose section of trim. "Did you sign?" he asked. "Not yet." "Why?" Clara wiped sawdust from her hands. "Because I finally understand why the agreement makes selling difficult." Daniel waited. "People who need money make different decisions from people who have money," she said. "I know that better than whoever wrote those pages probably ever did." "You need money?" "Exactly." She looked toward Black Pine. "Which means the rules may have been written for someone like me." Daniel glanced at the station. "That doesn't make your needs less real." "No, it makes the choice harder." Inside, Walter's proposal remained unsigned beside the old trust agreement. Clara had spent months wanting one thing she could call completely hers. Now she faced the possibility that the most valuable thing attached to Black Pine had never been intended to belong completely to anyone. The papers behind the locked door might make her wealthy, but if she took the easiest path to that wealth, she might have to destroy the very purpose those papers had preserved for 45 years. Clara did not reject Walter's offer immediately. She first wanted to know whether she had anything legally meaningful to refuse. Over the next several weeks, the records from Black Pine were compared against county files, recorded deeds, later agreements, and surviving tax documents. Edith spent hours reconstructing the administrative history. Miguel located records filed under parcel numbers that had changed decades earlier. Clara's attorney separated assumptions from evidence until the table at Black Pine held 3 categories: rights that had clearly expired, property legitimately transferred, and interests whose legal chain remained unresolved. The answer became less dramatic and more convincing. Nobody had secretly stolen the mountain. There was no single forged deed or hidden scheme. Instead, the Black Pine Community Land Trust had faded from active administration after the station closed in 1973. Staff changed, records were moved incompletely. Companies continued operating under agreements everyone assumed were valid. Later paperwork referenced earlier paperwork without anyone returning to the original documents. People kept repeating what the last file said. Edith explained, eventually repetition looked like proof. Clara looked toward the records room, and the originals stayed behind a locked door. Apparently, the locked room had not concealed treasure. It had preserved evidence. That distinction became clearer when the attorney identified several surviving land use and water access interests still tied to the old trust structure. Certain timber areas Crane's company treated as part of its long-term holdings traced back not to outright purchases, but to leases and later extensions whose underlying ownership had never been cleanly resolved. Other parcels Clara once thought connected to Black Pine were removed from consideration entirely because valid transfers had been found. She crossed them off her map herself. "Every time we find something valuable, we find 2 things that aren't," she told Daniel. "That's probably why this is starting to sound real," he said. The strongest evidence concerned the trust itself. The 1951 agreement established procedures for dissolution. After weeks of searching, nobody had located a dissolution instrument, final distribution, or court order terminating it. Tax and administrative activity had faded, but inactivity was not necessarily legal extinction. Clara's attorney warned her again that only formal legal review could determine whether authority had survived and whether her $1 deed transferred any of it. Walter came to Black Pine after receiving the latest findings from his own attorneys.
This time there was no purchase folder in his hand. "You turned down my offer," he said. "I haven't signed it." Same practical result. Clara placed a copy of the trust restrictions on the table. "I'm willing to negotiate, just not the deal you offered." Walter's expression hardened slightly. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Crane has invested here for years. I'm not pretending those investments vanish because I found old paper. But if these lands still belong under the trust, I won't transfer everything for unrestricted development. My company needs predictable access." "Then negotiate predictable access." "And timber rights, where they can legally continue." We discussed them. Where the trust restrictions apply, those restrictions matter. Walter studied her. "A month ago, you didn't know this trust existed." "A month ago, neither of us was reading the original agreement. You think a $1 deed makes you the authority over operations that have existed for decades? No. That's exactly what I'm trying to find out." Walter's frustration showed. "If your claim fails, you have no leverage. Then you won't need to bargain with me." He had no answer to that. His attorney's position remained that Crane's long-standing agreements and investments carried substantial legal weight. Clara's attorney agreed they could not simply be ignored. But the latest document review had weakened Walter's earlier certainty that the locked room records were historical curiosities. After he left, Clara stood in the records room among the filing cabinets. She thought about how easily she had imagined the door as deliberately hiding some secret fortune. The truth was more ordinary. Someone had stored records carefully. Someone else had put shelving across a door. Then time, neglect, and administrative confusion had done the rest. Yet ordinary mistakes could still have extraordinary consequences. Edith arrived the next morning with the final piece needed for the next legal step: a documented chain connecting the station's administrative role to the trust through its last active years. It did not prove Clara controlled the trust. It proved the question deserved formal determination. Clara's attorney filed for a hearing to establish what, if anything, survived, and whether the language in Clara's deed gave her legal authority over it. The date arrived by mail several days later. Daniel read the notice beside her. "Nervous, I bought a leaking building for $1. Apparently that wasn't enough uncertainty." He smiled. But Clara kept looking at the hearing notice. For weeks, she had negotiated as someone who might possess valuable rights. Walter had responded as someone who could no longer safely assume she did not. Soon, neither belief would matter. A court would examine the $1 deed, the 1951 trust agreement, and the records preserved behind Black Pine's locked door. Then Clara would learn whether she had any authority to negotiate at all. Clara entered the county courthouse carrying a copy of the deed that had cost her $1. The original records from Black Pine had been handled more carefully. Her attorney had submitted authenticated documents and certified copies while preserving the fragile originals. Edith sat behind Clara with Daniel across the room. Walter Crane and his attorneys waited with files of their own. The hearing began without drama. That almost made it harder. Dates, parcel numbers, transfers, leases, and legal descriptions replaced every grand idea Clara had entertained since opening the locked room. Her attorney traced the Black Pine Community Land Trust from its creation in 1951 through its years of active administration at the station. Crane's attorneys answered with later transactions and decades of accepted commercial use. Some questions were resolved quickly. Several parcels Clara had once circled on the old survey had been legally sold. They were not part of any surviving claim. Certain grazing rights had expired. Several access agreements had been replaced by later recorded instruments. One water interest Clara thought important proved too weakly connected to Black Pine to support her position. Clara watched pieces of the imagined fortune disappear one by one. She was surprised to feel relief mixed with disappointment. At least uncertainty was becoming fact.
Then the discussion turned to the trust itself. The 1951 agreement specified how dissolution could occur. The court reviewed the county searches, archival records, tax history, and documents Edith had helped identify. No dissolution instrument had been found. No final distribution of all trust property appeared in the record. No court order terminating the trust had been located. Inactivity, the judge explained, did not by itself establish that every surviving interest had vanished. Walter's attorney argued that decades of conduct and later transactions had to carry weight. The judge agreed. Historical neglect does not erase legitimate subsequent rights, he said. Clara's stomach tightened. Then he added, nor does subsequent assumption automatically extinguish an interest that was never lawfully terminated. The hearing moved to the $1 deed. Clara had read its language so many times she could almost recite it. The county had clearly transferred the Black Pine Station parcel. The disputed phrase followed surviving appurtenant administrative and beneficiary rights associated with Black Pine. County records showed no separate reservation of those rights when the station was disposed of. The question was whether anything legally surviving existed for the phrase to transfer. The answer took another hour. The court did not give Clara everything. She did not personally own thousands of mountain acres. She could not point at the old survey and declare every boundary hers. Several interests were excluded entirely. Existing lawful agreements remained enforceable. The trust restrictions also prevented its surviving assets from becoming her private property to sell however she pleased. But the trust had never been formally dissolved. Black Pine Station had remained its administrative property even after active management ceased, under the language of the county deed. The surviving administrative and beneficiary rights attached to Black Pine had passed with the station. Clara was recognized as the lawful successor custodian and controller of those surviving interests, subject to the original trust restrictions and existing valid rights. For several seconds, she did not understand what she had heard. Her attorney leaned closer. "You have authority," she whispered. "Not unlimited authority, but enough." Clara looked across the room. Walter was speaking quietly with his attorneys. He did not look defeated so much as recalculating. The finding did not erase Crane's investments or automatically end its operations. It did mean Walter could no longer treat the Black Pine documents as irrelevant history. Further valuation evidence addressed what remained certain lease interests: land use controls, access rights, and administrative authority over protected acreage. Their precise cash value depended on negotiation and restrictions, but collectively their potential economic value reached into the millions. Clara thought of the borrowed camper behind the diner. She thought of counting her savings after her mother died. She thought of buckets catching rain inside a building everyone had laughed at her for buying. The judge was still speaking about responsibilities, restrictions, and the need for proper administration. Those words mattered more than the valuation. Clara could not simply liquidate everything. The 1951 agreement still governed what could be sold, leased, protected, or used for community benefit. The hearing ended with more paperwork than celebration outside the courthouse. Clara stopped on the steps and breathed cold mountain air. Edith squeezed her arm before walking toward the parking lot. Daniel remained beside her. "You all right?" "I don't know." That seems to be the official answer to everything involving Black Pine. She laughed, exhausted. Daniel looked back at the courthouse. "So you're a millionaire?" Clara considered the question. "A month ago, the word would have sounded like rescue. Now it sounded inaccurate." She owned a ruined station outright, but the most valuable interests attached to it were restricted by promises made 45 years earlier. The court had not handed her a fortune. It had handed her authority over something other people had intended to survive them. "No," Clara said. "I think I just became responsible for something worth millions."
Daniel nodded toward the road leading back into the mountains.
"What are you going to do with it?"
Clara looked toward the distant ridge where black pine waited beneath its patched roof. For the first time since opening the locked room, the question was no longer what she had found. The question was what she would choose to do with it. Clara did not celebrate by spending money she did not yet have. The morning after the hearing, she returned to Black Pine, made coffee on the small stove, and sat at the work table with the 1951 trust agreement beside Walter Crane's old offer. For months, she had imagined security as a door she could lock behind herself. Now she controlled rights created specifically to prevent one desperate person from selling away something meant to endure. She called Walter and proposed negotiations. They were not friendly meetings. Crane Timber wanted predictable access and commercially useful timber agreements. Clara wanted the surviving trust land protected from unrestricted development while recognizing investments made under decades of accepted arrangements. Attorneys turned both positions into careful language. Some existing operations received secure, limited agreements where they were legally appropriate. Other areas remained protected under the trust restrictions. Crane agreed to compensation for continued rights and to settle disputed administrative claims rather than spend years fighting over them. Clara received a lawful settlement for interests that could be transferred without violating the trust. It was less than the imagined millions attached to the mountain rights, but more money than Clara had ever expected to possess. Enough to repair Black Pine properly. Enough to build savings. Enough that a broken pipe would become an inconvenience instead of a financial disaster. Walter signed the final agreement across a conference table from her. "You could have taken more personally," he said. "Maybe. Any regrets?" Clara considered it. "Ask me when the Ruth bill arrives." Walter almost smiled. They did not become friends. They did, however, leave with an agreement both could live under. Clara's first major expense was exactly what Daniel had predicted: the roof. He supervised structural repairs while Clara worked beside him whenever skill allowed. They replaced damaged sections rather than covering them, repaired plumbing, restored windows, and made the southern rooms warm enough for winter. Clara continued diner shifts until the settlement was finalized, then reduced her hours instead of quitting immediately. Black Pine slowly changed from a ruin into a working building. Part became Clara's permanent home. Another section became a modest mountain lodging house for hikers, travelers, and visitors to Silver Pass. She did not make it luxurious. She made it sound clean, warm, and affordable enough that people could actually use it. The old records office became something else entirely. Daniel repaired the frame around the reinforced door but preserved the door itself, including the marks left by the corroded hasp. The original records were placed in proper archival storage under professional guidance, while copies and selected historical materials remained at Black Pine for a small interpretive room explaining the station. Edith visited after the work was completed. She stood inside the restored records room longer than Clara expected. "Better than county storage in 1973, Edith finally said. "That is a dangerously low standard." Edith turned toward her, recognizing Daniel's old phrase in Clara's joke, and laughed. The trust itself was reorganized under proper legal administration with local oversight. Clara remained an important steward, but she insisted on a structure that prevented any future custodian from casually disposing of protected land alone. Miguel called that the first decision she had made that might save some future assessor a headache. Clara told him she considered that her contribution to public service. The change in her finances took longer to feel real. She bought no enormous house because she already had one she had fought to make livable. She replaced the unreliable vehicle only when repairs stopped making sense. She kept an emergency reserve large enough that she no longer checked her bank balance before buying groceries. One evening, while filing receipts, she realized she had gone an entire week without worrying about where she would live if something went wrong. She sat still at the desk when the realization came. Her mother's photographs stood nearby, no longer packed for the next move. Months passed.
Autumn faded, and the first serious winter snow covered the road and pine branches around Black Pine. The restored roof held. Clara stood outside beneath the porch overhang, watching white settle across the mountain. Daniel had gone home after checking a stubborn window latch. The last lodging guest had left that morning. For once, the station was quiet without feeling abandoned. Clara remembered her first night there, possessions still packed, buckets beneath leaks, thunder over the pass. People had laughed because she had paid $1 for a building that appeared worthless. In conventional terms, they had almost been right. Black Pine had needed more money and labor than its structure alone justified. What changed everything had been behind a door hidden by shelving filing cabinets, surveys, deeds, leases, and an old agreement whose value came not from the paper but from what the paper proved. The surviving rights had been valued in the millions. Yet Clara understood now why saying she had found millions in a locked room would never tell the whole story. She had found obligations too. The mining families who created the trust had understood something she had needed years of loss to learn. Ownership could protect a person, but it could also ask something of them. Clara had once wanted enough property and money that she would never depend on anyone again. Black Pine had instead connected her to people dead for decades, businesses still operating, neighbors who used the mountain, and people not yet born who might someday care what happened to it. Before bed, Clara walked through the station and checked the doors. She reached the restored records room last. Copies of the old General Holding Survey rested behind protective glass. The 1951 agreement was represented beside it, explaining why much of the land had been leased rather than sold. Clara switched off the light and pulled the old reinforced door closed. The lock was new now. She turned the key and held it for a moment. Most of her life, locked doors had seemed to belong to other people. Apartments she could no longer afford, opportunities postponed while caring for her mother, places that required money she did not have. Now she held the key to one herself. Not to a room filled with gold. Not to a private fortune waiting to be carried away. To a history that had survived because, by accident or intention, a forgotten room remained closed long enough for someone to find it. Clara slipped the key into her pocket and walked toward the part of Black Pine that was finally her home. She had bought an abandoned mountain station for $1 and discovered something worth millions behind its locked door. But the most valuable thing she had learned was simpler. Owning something did not mean taking everything it could give. Sometimes ownership meant deciding what was enough, accepting responsibility for the rest, and protecting what had been entrusted to you.